So I'd just like to start off by welcoming Dr. Jane Grenville to our second instalment of the Postwar Meets the York seminar series. Jane is Pro Vice-Chancellor of the University of York, as well as a Senior Lecturer in the Department of Archaeology, specialising in the archaeology of buildings, heritage policy and the conservation of the historic environment. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'd like to start off by asking, was your interest in the built historic environment and conservation something which gradually developed over time, or was it sort of right there from the beginning of your career in archaeology?
Certainly not there from the beginning of my career in archaeology. Mm-hmm. My initial interest was really in excavation and in field archaeology. But I can see that there was a sort of before that even, so that sort of arose when I was about 10 or 11. Yeah. But I can see from looking at my Ladybird book library that there was an interest in the built environment before that. You know, I've got the historic houses one, and I've got a landscape through history or whatever it was. So there was always that sort of there was always that interest there. And then I became very interested in archaeology, subsurface archaeology and landscape archaeology, and that was because my dad used to go shopping in Dorchester most days during the summer holidays, and he used to take me and leave me in the museum. Oh. And the Dorset County Museum, I can recommend, is a fantastic museum. Yeah. And there, to keep myself amused, I bought a copy of I Spy Archaeology. And that, you see, is what got me started on round barrows and long barrows and hill forts and all those things. Yeah. And then I really came back to the buildings angle when I was working in my later teens at Repton and also at Barton-on-Humber. And Harold Taylor was there, he of Anglo-Saxon architecture, and he taught me how to record buildings, and that was the point at which I became more interested in what was above the ground than what was below the ground. So to start with, and not for a great chunk of my teens, and then later on, so by the time I was a postgrad, it was certainly my area of interest.
Okay. In your research, you've addressed the importance of psychological factors in the conservation of the historic environment, with specific emphasis on Anthony Giddens' theory of ontological security. Would you be able to explain a little bit about what ontological security is?
It is just basically your sense of security in being. It's that kind of not having those terrible, gripping, heart-stopping moments where you think, I'm lost, and you might be lost physically, you might not know where you are, or you might be lost socially in a situation, or you might be lost intellectually. But it's ontological insecurity, I think, is that sense of panic, that you haven't quite got the markers on the map of where you are. Yeah. So and for me, what is really interesting is what creates ontological security, which is a sense of being at home in your own skin.
Can you remember what first prompted you to apply this theory?
No, I wish I could. I'm really annoyed that I can't. I was pursuing Giddens' idea of locale, and I think I must have been reading, I think, Constitution of Society or the Consequences of Modernity, and he developed it in more detail there, and I think I must have just read it there and thought, wait a minute, this may be more interesting even than the notion of locale. So I think it was probably to do with that.
I see.
But I can't remember the aha moment.
That's quite annoying, I bet. Are there any other areas of archaeology or heritage that you think it could be applied to other than...
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I started as a prehistorian, and I abandoned it because I felt in the end it was just, you could devise an explanation and there was nothing there against which you could tension your theory. There was no alternative evidence other than what you had before you and how you understood it through 20th century, now 21st century lenses. So I turned my attentions really to medieval, because I felt that the ability to look at what people were writing, even if what they did and what they said were two different things, nevertheless it gives you something to triangulate with your own 21st century notions. And because there is all that additional information, and it comes from legal records, principally the things that the kinds of records that Jeremy Goldberg looks at in the history department, and it comes from tenurial records, the kinds of records that Sarah Rhys-Jones, also in history, looks at, and it comes from literature, so the sorts of things that the medieval literature folks look at. And I used to work particularly with Phyllis T. Riddy, who's now retired, and Nick Haveley, who's also retired. But to look at that builds up a sense of how the society understood itself. And I've found that I can apply ontological security theories to trying to understand why there are open halls in the centre of York. Why would you build in the 14th and 15th century, as a merchant, an open hall?
Yeah.
And the notion of ontological security helps me to answer that, because I think the answer is there was a peripatetic teenage workforce. So instead of the next stage in the life cycle being going to university, it was going from your village into town to work as an apprentice. And you might stay, or you might eventually go back to your village. But you're moving from a rural locale where there is an open hall. Even in the smaller peasants' houses, there is a main open room in which various aspects of social control are exercised, and we can understand those very well, partly from the archaeology and partly from the historical and literary records. But there's no actual need for that in the town in the same way. And it seems to me that the reason why people built halls like that was to reproduce the social conditions of the countryside, in order to reassure both the apprentices and their parents that they were moving into a locale that they would feel at home in, that they would feel ontologically secure in. So I'm not sure, and it would be interesting, the person I would probably want to talk this through with as a prehistorian would be Penny Spikins. I'm not sure the degree to which I could make it work for prehistory, because I don't have those kind of control elements of evidence that I have for medieval history. But for medieval archaeology, I can make it work a dream for almost any situation.
It's really fascinating. I'd like to move a little bit forward from medieval now and ask you about the post-war redevelopment in the cities of Britain and Germany, which you discuss in your paper, Conservation of Psychology. I'd like to ask you, if you were given the chance to go back to one of these cities and see what it was like before the war, which would it be and why?
It would be Stuttgart, which wasn't one that I looked at for the purposes of that paper, but it is one that was comprehensively redeveloped as a modernist city. And the reason I'd like to go back there is that it's where my father grew up. So he and I have been back to it post-war, and he said, you know, this is very different, but I'd be very interested to go back and see what it was like pre-war.
So it has a personal resonance to you?
Yeah.
Okay. You also discuss the importance of the built historic environment to the notion of identity, whether that's personally, socially or nationally. And I was wondering, do you believe the built environment's contribution to the notion of identity is potentially more important than its historic and aesthetic value?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether I think it's more important, but what's interesting is that the listing criteria are entirely settled on aesthetic and historical value. And when you tension those criteria against how people feel about buildings, that's quite interesting. So I think the answer is it is as important. I think if you can explain very carefully to people who are non-specialist what it is that you're trying to get them to tell you about their feelings about the street and the town that they grew up in, then they begin to understand. The interesting thing for me is the difference between people who can't bear for anything to change, people who can't bear to keep anything, because, you know, what we need is a new, fresh start, and the people in the middle who say what we can do is build in an ontologically secure way in order to retain some of what's past, but rebuild. So we're at Heslington now, on the House West campus, and for me, it is pretty essential that we knock down the old class college buildings, because they are not fit for purpose, and as a senior manager, I can see that we're wasting money, we're bottom of the Green League because they're so hopeless in environmental terms. But for me, it's quite important that in doing that, we don't lose the look and feel of the Hes West campus, because it's now a part of the history of 75,000 people who did their first degree here and want to be able to have a sense that they have come back to York, not to somewhere unrecognisable that is on the same site as where they had their education. So that sense that we use the Andrew Derbyshire footprint, and we use the Andrew Derbyshire, he was the original architect, we use the Andrew Derbyshire idiom, but we rebuild in a way that might look rather different, in that it might embrace the original Andrew Derbyshire idea of coloured panels on the buildings. That, for me, is a kind of in-between. And on either end, you mustn't mess with any of it, even to the extent that you might not use a building rather than intervene into it, or that you just knock everything down and start again. For me, those are both neurotic reactions.
And it's about finding the balance.
And it's about finding the balance in the middle.
Like, buildings like here will have special resonance for a lot of people who studied here back in the 60s and things. I was wondering, is there a particular building that has special importance in your life?
King's Manor.
King's Manor.
Yeah. You know, like a lot of people. I mean, I'm based here now. I'm hoping to be able to return to King's Manor in September. But based here in Heslington Hall, I have a railway poster illustration of King's Manor on my desk. So I first encountered King's Manor before I was working for the university, when I was doing the listed buildings resurvey, and I used the library quite a lot there. And so it's been part of my life since 1984, and it is just the most magical building, and the ways in which we use it inventively, and the ways in which we're not too prissy about it. You know, we don't all sort of fall over having palpitations over the way in which Bernard Fielding made alterations to the early building in the 1960s. And we won't have palpitations about changing some of his changes in the future. So the way it's a really well-used historic building, and the way it is of such importance to so many generations of students and staff.
Okay. Finally, if you were given the chance to excavate on any archaeological site in the world, in the present day, or a site from the past, which would it be and why?
My site from the past, I would like to have a day excavating at Maiden Castle with Mortimer Wheeler. And the precise day that I would like to have is the day when the 5th form from the Green School in Dorchester went to visit, so that I could be digging and I could see my mum as a schoolgirl come to visit.
That'd be interesting.
So I'd like to do that, and it would be interesting to meet Rick Wheeler. He was obviously a hugely controversial character, and the sort of person about whom there would now be a Jimmy Savile type inquiry, I think. But it would be interesting to meet him. I can remember, I never met him, but I can remember when he died. I was already involved in archaeology. I was about 14, I think, when he died, and the people I was digging with were talking about him on the evening that he died. So, you know, I sort of just about overlap with that generation. But that's what I would like to do. If I could have my archaeological heart's desire, I would have the TARDIS take me to Chester in the 1280s, because I worked there looking at the Rose and an attempt to understand what the origin was. And we never cracked that one. And I would like to be able to go back and just do some structured interviews with the people who built them to find out what it was that they had in their minds.
Oh. And just one last question. This is a bit of a fun one that we're asking everybody. If you were to spend a day adventure seeking with Indiana Jones, what 3 items would you take to guarantee your survival?
I'd take my pack up.
Yep.
So that's a kind of composite because it's got Kendal mint cake and sandwiches and all the rest, and water. I would take my phone, particularly my lovely iPhone with its torch, in case he decided to take me somewhere ridiculous. And in later middle age, I would take my walking pole because one's balance becomes less good, and I recently fell over backwards and broke my wrist, so I've become more conscious of those things. So those would be the 3 things: pack up, phone and walking pole.
I think you would survive with those. I think that's everything, and thank you very much for talking to us today.
It's a pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.